Dear ladies and gentlemen, here is Andras Schwartz speaking, and you are listening to the podcast of Political Capital. Our newest broadcast is going to deal with the topic of Russia's meddling into European parliamentary elections and, in a broader sense, Russian information operation against Europe and against the transatlantic world. Here we have two distinguished speakers, Professor Dóra Győrffy from Péter Pázmány University and Péter Krekó, Director of Political Capital. Welcome you both.
Listening to the podcast of Political Capital Institute.
I would like to ask you a few questions in connection with a study recently published by Political Capital with the support of the Friedrich Neumann Foundation. This study dealt in detail with the options and possibilities Russia has for meddling into European elections and also with the tools used for such information operation. So the first question would go to Peter. What tools and means does Russia have to influence domestic politics in the European Union, let it be in the EU level or in the national countries?
This is the most important question. We are just after the European Parliament elections, and I think there are good news and bad news. Good news is that we could not really see a systemic attempt from the side of Russia to change the outcome of the European Parliament elections. There have been some sporadic hackings. There were some cases of disinformation, but we have not seen such kind of systemic influence as we could observe, for example, in the US presidential campaign in 2016, the Brexit vote in 2016, or, for example, the French presidential election in 2017. But this is, at the same time, bad news as well, because probably the reason is beyond the difficulties, the technical difficulties of interfering into European Parliament elections. You have to interfere in at least 5-6 big member states or even more. The possibility for that lack of interference could be that Russia regarded the European Parliament election as not important enough to interfere. Why? Possibly because there have been many Russian critical resolutions from the European Parliament, more than a dozen in the last 5 years, in the last cycle, and most of the recommendations that the European Parliament raised were not really met with the support of the European Council or the European Commission. So in short, we could not see these systemic efforts, but this is not necessarily only good news.
But this leads to the question, what are Russia's goals? What are Russia's objectives vis-à-vis the European Union? What kind of European Union would people in Moscow like to see?
Russia would like to see a European Union which is weak and fragmented. Russia would like to negotiate with countries on a bilateral basis where Russia has an asymmetric advantage of size. So Russia is trying to undermine mainstream parties which are supporting European integration. Basically, this is why Russia is supporting and financing Euro-skeptic parties. And what we have seen in European parliamentary elections, that this came to light in Austria, but also in Moldova and in Brazil. They are trying to influence internal politics.
Peter, what are your views about Russia's objectives vis-à-vis the European Union?
Paraphrasing Kissinger's quote on who to call in Europe, I would say that Russia's response would be that let's call the member states instead of Brussels. Russia so far could not really deeply influence the operation and the policy outcomes on the European level. In the European Parliament, there is a solid majority of the Russia critical forces, and even in the new European Parliament, we can say that about 2/3 of the members of the new European Parliament, or even more, will be ones who are rather critical towards Russian interference into European politics and Russian geopolitical adventures. When it comes to the European Commission, with the new energy package and some guidelines that want to weaken the energy dependence from Russia, I think Russia can be a bit less satisfied with their achievement in pushing through their goals through the Commission. And when it comes to the European Council, the sanctions are still capped, while there are many countries that want to raise them. Italy, Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, to name a few. So in short, Russia does not like an integrated European Union. And as Dóra said, the most important goal of them is to weaken the European integration because their experience is that they can do business way better with the member states than with the EU institutions.
And when it comes to weakening the European Union as a whole, as a collective institution, we all know that one of the core elements of such Russian operations is disinformation in the broader sense, in the wider sense. So now I would suggest to focus a bit on this very particular problem of disinformation. First and foremost, I mean, besides Russia's own channels, we all know the RT, the Sputnik, we know the whole domestic Russian media conglomerate. When it comes to the European Union, who are those actors? Who are the ones who are spreading disinformation or manipulative news in the broader sense within the European Union?
What we could observe, and this is probably the most important finding of this study, is that while Russian narratives appear quite broadly in Central Eastern Europe, and sometimes they coming through the mainstream media, the most important proponents of such narratives are not directly Russian outlets, but domestic populist players who are interested in a more disintegrated Europe and want to use Russian narratives and Euro-skeptic narratives to gain more support domestically. So indirectly, Russian narratives appear a lot and disinformation in the European information environment, but we should not only blame Russia for that, because there are political players and they are getting stronger who want to spread these messages.
Dóra?
I completely agree. There are different types of political players in the field. So we see politicians, especially the far-right parties, whose message is strongly lining up with Russia. And basically, we see a two-way relationship. So they take over Sputnik or RT news, but they also create their own news, which is taken over by Russian media. So it's basically a two-way street. Then there are also media sites. In social media, there are some Russian-financed media, but in Hungary, for example, we know that the public broadcasting is also taking over these Russian news. And there are also academics sporadically who spread these messages and try to be somewhat different. And sometimes they are both pro-Russia, but sometimes they are just useful idiots. And so basically it comes from all segments of society. And then it goes to social media, various blogs, Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere.
I think very important just to name a few political forces that are spreading, let's say, pro-Russian, Euro-skeptic, let's say, anti-Western messages for domestic purposes. Miloš Zeman in Czech Republic, Fidesz in Hungary, and the Slovakian National Party, SNS in Slovakia, are all players that usually speak in a very similar language and use very similar messages that we can see in Russia today or even in the Russian domestic media. But on the other hand, the most important reason we think is not that these actors are directly called by Vladimir Putin that please say this and that, but it resonates to the attitudes of the public. In Slovakia, we see quite strong anti-American attitudes. For example, in Hungary, there are some strong Euro-skeptic attitudes and very strong nationalist attitudes at the same time. And in the Czech Republic, there is this quite traditional form of Euro-skepticism. This can be all exploited by domestic political actors.
Which basically leads us to the next question. You said that it's not only Russia whom one needs to blame, but their part of the blame is also on our side. What is your opinion, Dóra? What are the factors which make the EU so vulnerable to disinformation? Where are our weaknesses?
I think a lot of things happened in technology recently. So basically, before the media was highly edited and organized and basically led by elites. So editors strictly narrowed the scope of subjects, the tone of the media. And with the social media, basically everybody got a voice. And Russia can interfere in the domestic debates on any issue. And Russia has long history. Soviet Union has a long history of trying to influence the West through provoking debates, increasing polarization of society, and basically social media gives them a very cheap tool for spreading these messages. A second issue, I think, is that we are all suffering from information overload. So basically, anything happens in any part of the world, we immediately learn about it. I think I'm not alone spending, 10 hours or 14 hours a day reading the news. But basically something is very far from us. So everybody is vulnerable to misinformation because there is no way to check it. And it's also important that creating fake news is much more simple than creating real news, because for real news, you have to go after what happened, who are the actors, what are their interests, and all that. Creating fake news is just, some Macedonian teenagers can write up 10 or 100 a day, and they don't have to worry about fact-checking or asking different actors. So basically, it takes much less time. And basically, they flood the internet with these kinds of fake news, and people believe like only 50% of it, but that's still 50% fake news. And basically, fact-checking is also taking a lot of time and effort. So fake news is always spreading much faster than real news. And so it's important, I think, to we will talk about what can be done, but being aware of these dangers.
Which also means that factual knowledge or knowledge in general should increase the resilience to fake news. And when this knowledge is not present, or not present in detail, for example, when it comes to the minuscule details, minor details of how the European Union functions, this probably also offers an attractive spot for anyone who would like to conduct information attacks. When it comes to the functioning of the European Union. But let's try to change side in a way. If you were the ones spreading disinformation, you just change affiliation. What would be those panels, or what would be those topics through which you would try to discredit the European Union or discredit NATO or the United States? If you have some ideas to suggest, or to point out what our weak spots are, why these spots are weak?
So I think one important element of fake news is to have some truth about it. But at the beginning, I think having half-truths is usually a good idea to start with, and then arouse emotions. So basically provoke a kind of moral panic. And, you can easily do that with the EU. It depends on the country, because every country is upset about different aspects of the European Union. So for donor countries, I think it's very easy to provoke some kind of moral panic about wasting EU money and how wasteful is EU bureaucracy and how poorly the money is used. And, I think in the donor country, that's a strategy. In this part of the world, in Central and Eastern Europe, they have been very successful in provoking moral panic over migration. And then in Southern Europe, they can also be very useful in provoking an antagonism towards Germany by blaming the country for austerity and for all the suffering and unemployment and, wage decreases that these countries have gone through. So basically you have to just kind of formulate the right message and have some kind of half-truth, and then this moralization of that, and, it's there.
And we haven't even mentioned the topic of traditional values allegedly endangered by the European Union.
Yeah, what is particularly important, I think, in this part of the European Union is that why the citizens know that in terms of money, the advantages of the European Union are obvious. At the same time, there is this narrative which can contain particles of truth that we are regarded to be, let's say, second-level citizens of the European Union. We are just the colonies of Western European states and their big companies. We are just needed for the cheap workforce and for the bigger market. And we are exploited. And we are not on the same level in terms of recognition as the Western European states. And I think I would put it in a broader context and say that in the geopolitical narratives and even in the populist narratives in Central Eastern Europe, you see this emerging new identity that Central Eastern Europe is the last bastion of Christianity, of traditional values, as you told, and the part of Europe that is safe from immigration. And generally, we can say that Central Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe is more valuable, is superior to the West, while we have to learn since the transition that we are inferior to the West. And I think this is a powerful narrative, and the Russian propaganda and the populist propaganda is playing with that.
Dóra?
Yeah, I completely agree. This godless West as a concept, that the West has lost Christianity. And basically they are focusing on traditional values, which is traditional marriage, traditional gender roles, and anti-LGBT messages. But I think it's also important to emphasize that Christianity is more than that. And, this faith, hope and love kind of message is missing, because what I think it's also important part of the message that what they want to provoke is cynicism, hopelessness, and hate. And they are doing it with the Christian message, which I think does a great disservice to Christianity in general. And actually, in Italy, the Catholic Church is a very strong opponent of Salvini because of that. They sense the danger, and they sense the danger very correctly.
Yeah, when the Christianity in the Russian propaganda and in the populist messaging is defined against the Pope, I think it shows how sincere it is.
And when it comes to all these emotions or despair or hopelessness, these disinformation channels try to induce, try to generate. Peter, a methodological question. How can we measure the effect? Because so far we've been talking about our own vulnerabilities as well as about the tools our adversaries are using. How to measure the effect? Is it possible at all?
Yeah, without wanting to drive all listeners asleep with very long methodological discussions, I would highlight two important points. One is that, yes, impact is always difficult to measure. You can check the outreach of the propaganda messages and see how big part of the society is affected by the certain message, or you can turn to public opinion polls. The problem with the latter is that you cannot really separate the impact of the, let's say, disinformation messages from the attitudes that are already there. So, for example, if we find that there are very strong, let's say, traditionalist narratives and attitudes in Poland, it does not mean that this is only because of Russian propaganda, because yes, Russian propaganda want to exploit that, but this is a country where these have generally deep roots. What we could find, I think, in Hungary, that in many cases where the governmental propaganda picked up some Russian disinformation narratives, mostly for domestic purposes, about George Soros, about migration, about the West and the European Union, it had a strong impact on the public opinion. But I think Hungary is a special case because no other EU member states have such centralized media environment.
The media environment already leads us basically to the second question. Dóra, in the beginning, you already mentioned the role of technology. And of course, like with the development of technology, both information and the spread of disinformation have much better, way more functioning, faster, quicker, and more flexible channels than any disinformators or disinformants had, let's say, a century ago. So regarding the question of technology and the role of technology in information warfare or disinformation in general, what are your views about the use of technology, either for or against disinformation? Do you have best practices in mind, for example?
Well, I think technology is a tool and, it's about intent. So how technology is used is the important. And, the bad actors can use technology and the good actors can use technology. And this is a kind of competition between them. And now Twitter, Facebook, and all these companies try to implement algorithms to somehow depress fake news reach. But their incentive system is questionable because they have gained greatly by Russians participating in these discussions. Russians were also paying them, and you can read issues that they are actually invested in Facebook. So basically, they have to calculate whether it is worth getting that Russian money or whether there is a vulnerability to their brand. So basically, their reputation is at stake and what is worth more. So they are doing what they need to do for their reputation, but they are also strongly interested in keeping light regulation for their sector. And that light regulation might go with, a Republican president. and with Russian money. And so I am skeptical that we can entrust this on the technological companies. And this is why the European Union and, tries to regulate them. And there are issues for regulation in the US as well. But Democrats at this point are not able to implement those.
Dora, you mentioned already like technological solutions such as taking down fake news accounts. You also mentioned regulatory solutions. Peter, do you see any other ways of how to increase the resilience of the society vis-à-vis disinformation besides regulatory or technological measures?
Yes, and if we, for example, read the EU Action Plan Against Disinformation, which was a document that was prepared practically by all EU institutions, and this is a very important document, we can be a bit skeptical if it will be implemented in details. Unfortunately, the typical Brussels thing is to prepare a good document and then do nothing to simplify it a bit.
This is disinformation, right?
Yeah, you can call that anti-EU disinformation, but unfortunately, in some cases, this is really the case. What the general problem is, I think, that if we take it for granted that social actors and political actors are interested in pushing back disinformation, there can be a lot to do. You can set up expert bodies who can help to remove the harmful content. You can do media literacy trainings. You can do a lot of awareness raising in the public to shield the journalists and the people against disinformation. And I think all this can be successful if everyone just puts a bit more effort into recognizing fake news and disinformation. It's relatively easy to do. And even in the changing information environment, I think with a bit of thinking, it's not always that difficult to recognize fake news and disinformation pieces. The problem comes when the political actors themselves are interested in spreading fake news and disinformation. And it is a case to a certain extent. It was the case in the 2016 US presidential election. It was the case in the Brexit electoral campaign. It was the case in the last Hungarian election campaign. It was the case in Italy. So if the political wants to spread disinformation, then I think the policy players cannot do too much to hamper it.
We already quoted once Vladimir Lenin when speaking about the useful idiots, полезные идиоты. So let's use another Lenin quote, what to do, что делать. I mean, in that particular situation, when we take a country where it's the central government which is spreading disinformation, what are the tools and means non-governmental actors or basically anybody else can do, how to step up against the centrally spread disinformation? Dora?
Well, in a society where citizens are very active and aware of politics, then there are quite a few tools to utilize. So, for example, in higher education, you can teach methods to differentiate true information from false information. For companies and for citizens, they can be aware of fake news and they can also make others aware of fake news. And for example, on social media, they don't repeat or forward or fake news. And also there should be a social expectation from companies not to spend on sites which promote fake news. So basically there is a company responsibility. But obviously all of these methods assume some sort of independence of these actors from the governments. And one other thing I would like to add is that I think the success of Russia to, influence elections all over the world was strongly based on having a surprise. So the surprise value of this information warfare is important. I think this has been lessened in the past few years. And I think it's very important to make everybody aware that, not everything is true that you find on the internet.
That's a very good point. Peter?
I would pick up on the point of companies because this is something that we talk less about generally. I do think that while we talk a lot about disinformation in the political scene, most of the disinformation that surrounds us are apolitical and are spread for direct profit. For example, for fake news sites that can have a lot of viewers and readers, therefore they can generate a huge profit. So cutting of the finances of these fake news sites will be, I think, the primary interest for big companies, because otherwise they can be important targets of disinformation. And probably a company is easier to to be persuaded about the damage of fake news than politicians themselves, because most of the politicians feel that, okay, we are heading towards a post-truth era, where if you want to win an election, then you have to use fake news. So I have some hope in the companies. And on the other hand, I think the traditional media, everybody talks about that the mainstream media is dead. Why? It's not true. What we can find is that even disinformation, in a lot of cases, quotes pieces in mainstream media, and even in the online discussions, people are quoting articles. So journalists can, I think, still do a lot in fact-checking, in revealing disinformation. And given that nobody wants to be deceived, I think we can build on this skepticism of the citizens and their need not to get deceived.
This sounds surprisingly optimistic compared to the original topic we had, so I'm very positively surprised. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the podcast of Political Capital with two distinguished guests, Professor Dóra Győrffy from Pázmány Péter Catholic University and Peter Krekó from Political Capital. I was András Rácz moderating the discussion, and please don't forget to check out the Facebook, Twitter and Instagram account of Political Capital, as well as our newest study financed by the Friedrich Neumann Foundation about Russia's meddling in the European Parliament elections. Thank you all.